Hey there, and welcome to the Foodscaper Podcast, where we dig deep into the growing world of foodscaping, one conversation at a time. I'm your host, Matt Lebon, and on each episode, we are unearthing the stories of those who have turned their passion for growing food and nurturing ecological landscapes into thriving professions. From seasoned pros to fresh faces in the industry, we'll chat with the innovators and trailblazers who are transforming how we think about food production and landscape design. Whether you're contemplating a career in foodscaping or you're already knee-deep in garden soil, our guests will share their insights, experiences, and inspirations to help you cultivate your own path.
I would go around and we would design community garden space all around North America.
Get ready to dig into some rich conversations. Let's get growing. A big thanks to our podcast sponsors, Epic Gardening and Stark Brothers Nursery. Thank you both. Welcome everybody to a Foodscaper Podcast. I am tickled to have such a amazing guest joining us today. We've got Joe Lample, or Joe Gardner, as you may know him, a true leader in the gardening movement. He has many educational programs from his online gardening academy. He's the creator and host of Growing a Greener World and the Joe Gardner podcast. I'm sure so many of you have tuned in to the many offerings that Joe has bestowed upon us garden lovers over the years. So Joe, so great to have you with us. I'm pumped to dive into this conversation.
Me too, Matt. Thank you for having me.
To get us started, ground us in where you're joining us from and some of the geographic components of where you're based.
I am on the northeast side of Atlanta, Georgia, suburbs. If you were downtown, I would be about 30 miles northeast of the city. Still considered Metro Atlanta because we have no geographic boundaries to stop growth. So Atlanta, downtown is the hub, and we go out 360 degrees in all directions. And every year that band gets wider and wider. I love where I live. I am fortunate enough to be on 5 acres, surrounded by other people with acreage, and it's kind of an equestrian community. For all the years of traveling I've done, I've always couldn't wait to get back home. But I love it here, and I love the land, and I love what I've done with it. Just, I have no plans on going anywhere else. I've just been here all my adult life, and I love it here.
One of the things that we're always noticing is how many foodscaping companies are in Atlanta.
Wow.
I don't know if you've connected with many of them. The hunger for foodscaping companies in Atlanta is just enormous. 2 of the larger staffed companies, which are Community Foodscapes and Shades of Green Permaculture, are in Atlanta. There's several others that are Abundance Landscapes and all these folks have collaborated with us and come to our conference and presented and stuff. And what a really cool opportunity to be in such a hub of growing down there.
I did not know that, but I'm not surprised because we are now in Zone 8A, formerly 7B, and we can have a beautiful foodscape year-round here. That may have something to do with it, but I'm really happy to hear that because I've never really thought of Atlanta as being on the cutting edge of growing food and proactively making that a part of their integrated landscape. That brings joy for me to hear that.
So to jump into our conversation, tell us a little bit of the story of the turning point that kind of got you into the gardening and farming. I know that you shared a cool story on your website about being into horticulture as a kid, but I'm really curious about that piece of when you shifted to growing food and the passion for providing that sustenance.
Yes. Okay. Back to day one, when I was 8, in that story of discovering gardening, it was just an accidental breaking of a branch and sticking it in the ground, and it took root, and I discovered that about 8 weeks after it happened. And I looked, oh my God, what just happened? That's just so cool. One of the first things I did was start a vegetable garden, planting that row of bush beans along the wall of my parents' bedroom and nurturing that along. And knowing it, I didn't grow up in a family of gardeners. I didn't know anything about it. I was doing it the best I knew how, and I'm not sure how I knew how. Maybe it was just intuition. These seeds are pretty well programmed to take care of themselves if you just give it the right location. And I lucked out there. But anyway, it spurred my interest tremendously for food growing, as well as all growing, but particularly with food. But, things happen and you go down different paths. And so I wasn't always growing food in my younger life. Fast forward to college and coming out of that, I ended up wearing a suit and tie for the first couple of years out of college, begrudgingly, but it did provide for a nice income getting started. But I always knew that my true path and where my heart lies was in horticulture and plants and working with people and plants. I knew that was where I would end up, but I didn't know how I would get there. That moment finally occurred, and it was never in my field of vision. I was always looking out from my 20-something floor fancy office in downtown Atlanta, envious of the guy in January in a sleeting rain planting pansies. And I'm like, I want to be that guy. But I couldn't afford to make that move at that time just because, I recently married and I think we had a couple of daughters at that point. The break came when I got an email. I was in my suit and tie in my office in downtown, and this email came through from a publisher of a new magazine who had recently asked me to begin writing a regular column for her magazine on turf care. I could keep grass looking good, but that really wasn't my passion. When she was looking for referrals, everybody kept mentioning me. She reached out to me in an email, asked if I would write this column, and I said, yeah, I'd do that. And so that was kind of the last communication we had at the time. But a week or two later, and again, I'd never met her, never knew her. A week or two later, she emails me and says, Joe, I just got this email from HGTV, and they're looking for a host of a new television series they're doing on DIY Network about growing food. And everything's in place, but now they're looking for the host. And who they've described is you. You need to reach out to them, sell yourself, and get them to pick you. And I'm like, well, I watch all those shows on HGTV. I felt I could communicate pretty well and I could maybe do that. So I did reach out. And thankfully, my business training was sales related. I was used to calling strangers to get them to meet with me. And so I called the producer. I found him, called him, got him to have lunch with me. It was the most awkward lunch I've ever had. But, especially strangers. He'd ask me all these questions and he would just sit there like he was playing poker with his poker face. I'm good at reading people, but I couldn't read this guy. At the end of the lunch, I didn't have a sense whether he liked me or not. It was kind of like you always hear them say, don't call us, we'll call you. He said, I'm going to talk to my producer about you. We got a meeting at HGTV in a week or two. And if we're interested in you, we probably want to do a screen test and we'll get back to you, but I'll let you know. No commitment, no promises. I got back in my car after that lunch and I thought, what just happened? Was that good or not? But anyway, a couple of days later, he called me and said they really liked me and they wanted me to do a screen test. So we went through all of that process to assess their host candidates, and they had their meeting and presented all the candidates at the corporate office at HGTV, and they narrowed it down to me as the male, but they'd only been looking at males, and they decided they also wanted to look for females just to make sure they'd picked the right person. So they went through the whole search again, another 6 weeks or so, national search, narrowed it down to one female, and I was the male, and then they had to decide between the two of us. And a week later, they called me and said, we picked you. The show is about growing food. From seed to harvest, my role as the host was to teach people in every episode how to grow that one crop. That episode would have been dedicated to one crop, like tomatoes, one show, peppers, one show, eggplant, one show, winter squash, one show, etc. And it was created with the idea of it would be 26 episodes, so that would be a full year of shows. It was going so well in the first season that they said, we want to extend the show to 3 years and 52 episodes. Each show was one crop feature. I loved it. I loved that they picked me. I wasn't afraid of the camera. And I was teaching, which I think was my gift from my mother, who was the smartest woman I know and a dedicated high school teacher. I think I got that from her. So I was able to teach about my passion in life through national television. I really dove into the deep end, but it worked. It reinforced my love of food growing and teaching people how to grow food, the importance of growing food, and how empowering that was for so many reasons. And that was the launch pad for everything that's happened since then.
Wow. What a wild ride that must have been in those early days of making that transformation from the suit and tie to the garden. So what got to be a fun story to relive for you. I'm curious if there was a time in there that you had broken off and done your own business? Because I had read a little bit about that somewhere and doing some prep for this
Mhm.
interview. I was curious where that fits in. Did you do horticultural consulting and design at some point? Am I
Yeah.
right on that?
You're right on that, and that actually happened before I was picked to host the TV show. So that worked into my resume nicely. I knew that I was never going to detach from my love of being involved with plants just because I had to go to work from 9 to 5 in a suit and tie. My side gig, my side hustle, because I just wanted that attachment to plants and people, was consulting and
Yeah.
design work. Through random connections, I was able to scratch that itch all the time. And I loved it. A lot of that was self-taught, but mainly it was just my way of keeping the connection and that line tight. Even though on the weekends, I could not wait to get up on Saturday morning to go out in my backyard and play in the dirt because that's what fed me, but also the interaction with the people and maybe practicing on them.
So many people are asking, how do I get into this foodscaping profession, like for a living?
Mhm.
And one of the common pieces of advice that we give or people give is start with it as a side hustle while you're doing your main job that pays the
Yeah.
bills. It's funny how interesting opportunities will start to present themselves once you get your name out there. You don't have to stick your neck so far out there as to lose your day job. And that will start to get the good juju going in the community so that something exciting will come around. For you, it's a show. For other people, it might be a really exciting job that gives them a ton of exposure, gives them enough capital or enough confidence to invest in some capital and really make their business start. So I think it's a really relevant story for people.
You nailed it. I think you're exactly right there. I don't encourage people to necessarily dive into the deep end. I think about my story, and I feel like that was a very unique opportunity that I had. That's kind of a one of a million. That was my lottery win. Not everybody has that opportunity, but I think when you do the right thing and you're
Hmm.
not motivated just because you're trying to see how much you can make off of that job, that comes through. And I think the karma comes out, and people see the work that you've done and the mentions get made. And before you know it, that one first job leads to another one, which leads to another one. It happens.
Yeah. I want to transition us to talk a little bit about your home garden. You are somebody who has done so much traveling and seen a ton of gardens, done educational videos on them. I want to get there. But first, I want to stay at home in Atlanta because I'm really smitten with the garden I see on your YouTube videos. It's a beautiful vegetable garden. And that is what many of us are in the business of creating. When I look at your vegetable garden, I'm like, dang, that's pro. Let's talk about your home vegetable garden and we can get geeky here. I'm curious about things like the lumber that you chose and
Yeah.
those and the width of your beds, even soil amendments that you might be using. What was the little playbook for your own garden design?
I love geeky conversations related to gardening, so I am all in on this one. Prior to building this garden, I worked for a number of years as a consultant with Fiskars. And I was there. My role, part of my role with them, I mean, I think it was maybe before influencer days, but I was kind of their influencer. But I
Yeah.
would go around and we would design community garden space all around North America. So the US and Canada was basically where we would go. And over the course of a few years, I think I did this 16 different times. We created pop-up raised bed community gardens, large raised bed community gardens. 18, 20, 30 beds, and it would all get done in a day. It was amazing. I would
Eh,
design the whole thing ahead of time, get it approved through the executives. We would fly in a couple days early. I would lay out the garden footprint, get our team assembled, all the stuff would be delivered. And that morning, we would go on site the day of the build, 4 in the morning. It was always pitch black dark, and we're trying to feel our way around. And by the time the sun was coming up, people are showing up. These would be volunteers from Home Depot in certain cases and Canadian Tire when we were in Canada. They'd bring a bunch of their employees in. So there would be roughly 150, 200 people on site for that day. All the
oh,
timbers would be there, all the equipment. My two favorite parts of that day would be as people were leaving their homes to go to work in the morning, they couldn't help but walk through us and by us because we were in their common space. Reading their faces and saying, what's going on here? They had a sense of what was happening. It's like, wow, there's a lot of people and a lot of stuff. But the best part was by the time they came home from work, we were done and everything was planted out. And the joy on their face just was contagious. So it started, Matt, to get to your question, when I built these beds and designed these beds, they were exactly what you see, not the layout per se, but the beds themselves, the timbers, the size of the bed, the 3-stack 6x6 timbers. They were untreated Western red cedar. And eventually the budget got to, that was a big spend and they had to cut back on that. But initially I spec'd out that. So that's what we built. And every time I was in those gardens, I always left a bit jealous because I thought, dang, these are the best beds ever. And I don't have anything like this at my house. Someday, maybe.
Yeah.
So that went on for a few years and 16 of those events. When I got here 13 years ago and we were filming for my show, I didn't have my food garden yet, but it was time to build it. And I thought, dang, if it's ever going to be a time where I could justify installing a really nice garden, now's the time. I bit the bullet, made some calls, got a company to supply the material for his cost. I called the guys from Fiskars in Wisconsin, flew them down for a weekend, the designers, the engineers who actually figured the construction out, flew them down with a promise of all the pizza and beer you could consume over the weekend. We had a great time starting on Friday afternoon, and by Sunday at lunchtime, the whole garden was built. The beds were. And I filled them later, but that's how it started. The layout itself was just, I sat down on my computer one night with a sheet of graph paper in front of me, and in a matter of minutes laid out the design. It just worked out. I would not change one single thing today.
What aspects of the design do you feel like might be noteworthy to highlight? Like the orientation of the beds, the widths of the beds or the pathways themselves, or the way that you located an entrance.
Yeah.
Now, looking back, that was a good design decision, and I'm glad I did that.
I think it was rooted in symmetry. I am pretty OCD, and I like straight lines. I like order. I like right angles. I like dimensions that are 1x2, 2x4, 4x8, just that ratio. And so in my beds, there's a lot of perpendicular design. It's just horizontal and vertical orientation. It kind of looks a little bit like a maze, but it's really repetition of 4 beds 4 times. So there's 16 raised beds, and the pattern repeats 4 different times with a central axis down the horizontal and vertical. They intersect in the middle, and each quadrant is in one of those quarters, and it just works. If you were to look down from a drone, it's just mirror images in all 4 quadrants.
Yeah, so I'm hearing you say symmetry. I'm hearing you say 4 quadrants and like a main pathway on the vertical and another main pathway on the horizontal. Those are the things that give it the structure that help you feel like it's a well-designed, well-proportioned garden.
I do.
You went with the 3 timbers high, and you went with the 6x6.
I did. Chunky.
Yeah.
And I like it because at the height, 18 inches, which is the height of a chair. If you were to sit in a chair, it's 18 inches from the ground. Sitting on that bed, 6 inches is plenty wide enough, but you can weed, you can be on your knees and have your elbows resting on the edge of the bed and reach in. And the bed orientation there, most of them are 12x4. A couple of them 4 of them are 12x3, but you can reach in from either side and get to the middle without having to go into it. Even today, this many years later, it makes me happy every time I walk in the garden, and there's nothing about it that I would change other than wondering what I could have done to prolong the life of the cedar. It's been 13 years in year-round food production in hot, humid Atlanta with termites. It's starting to degrade, and I'm having to realize that, the end is near where I have to replace this stuff, but I'm not looking forward to that.
Wow. What do you think?
I'm working on that.
Yeah. What do you think the lifespan is going to be when you look back and say, my 6x6 beds lasted this long?
I think I've got 3 more years before I really have to change everything out, but a few of them are starting to degrade beyond my comfort level as far as aesthetics, but they're still
Yeah.
functional.
Where are they degrading? Are there certain locations within the beds that you could have fortified with a small amount of protection and they would have lasted longer?
I probably would have had to line them, but to your question, they're degrading at the base and the corners. And I believe that's because the moisture is saturated the most. And even I have very good draining soil, I still think when the water is in the beds, in the soil, it's moving through and it's either slowing down at the bottom of the bed and maybe
Yeah.
congregating in the corners.
Do you have any corner blocking? Like we call it a block. I don't know if that's the correct term, but basically in the corner of the beds we build, a lot of people put like a 4x4 to protect that joint and to add further strength. Of course, they're not usually using 6x6s, but even so, if we put a board in that corner, then that whole thing has got to rot out before the water is getting to the actual corner.
I didn't do that, and that's a great idea. Something in that corner definitely in the future will be there. You don't know what you don't know at that point, and I didn't.
Oh, of course.
Now I do.
Yeah. I mean, that's a great lifespan, and it's a beautiful thing to use a regenerative product like
Mhm.
that is, going to return back to the earth.
And it's starting to do that now.
Yeah. That's cool. So let's talk about soil within those beds. This is a really common question for our foodscapers because it's like, if I don't put a super premium blend of soil into these garden beds, then I'm going to have upset customers who are like, why aren't my things growing?
Right, right.
And one of the I've heard you talk about in your videos is like soil takes time to build up in terms of its biological power. And that is always a hard thing to communicate to clients because they want it now. They want
Yes.
it I'm curious. It seems like you've got the topsoil, the compost, and some other different things. I'm curious if you feel like you've iterated on that at all, or if a foodscaper is going to say, I need to make my own soil blend. What should I put in my garden bed so that I'm sure my clients have a really fertile garden?
Okay. Yes. And I started off when I filled those beds initially. I have experience and training to know what I think I need in those beds. What I went with would be called high quality topsoil. What is topsoil? There's really no definition for that. So I'm gonna describe what I would define it to be. But 50% of my bed was set aside or allocated towards high quality topsoil. I got lucky because there's a commercial provider of mulch and soil north of me. I went out there to look at it before I committed to it. This is a thing I recommend everybody does, whether it's the foodscapers themselves or their clients, but the foodscapers really probably the onus is on them to have the expertise to source the right material. So for me, it was going to the source, literally walking out to the mountain of topsoil, grabbing it, squeezing it, smelling it, making sure that when I squeezed it, it bound together. But when I ran my fingers through it, it broke apart. It wasn't so sticky. It smelled earthy. It was dark in color. It was rich, and there was no off-putting smell to it. That's my non-scientific criteria. But for me, that was the middle checklist I had to see with my own eyes and ears and nose to approve. So anyway, I found that 50% of the bed would be filled with 30% high-quality compost. Similar challenge there because not all compost is created equal, especially on a commercial level. When you got tipping stations dumping anything and everything there, including persistent herbicides sometimes. That same source was the source of my compost, which turned out to be fabulous. So 30% high quality compost, 50% high quality topsoil, and then the remaining 20%, a mix of organic material. And the more diversity within that 20% mix, the better. But within that mix, you could have semi-composted shredded leaves. You could have aged poultry manure, not horse manure because of the persistent herbicides that are likely in a lot of horse manure these days. Rotted straw, not hay, rotted straw.
Yeah.
Mushroom compost, grass clippings that aged from your own property or property that has not been sprayed with herbicide, and other things. It's a big mix. It's not layered in there. It's all blended in because substrates of different porosity don't drain as well. or don't drain at all. But once you hit a different substrate, the water is held above it. I mix it all together to create optimal drainage and the greatest homogeneous blend of that material throughout the bed.
That's a great recipe for so many of us to follow who are needing to figure out how to fill our beds with something that's proven. It sounds like you had it for 13 years and you have loved it. I'm curious about amendments like fertilizer, mycorrhizal inoculants, and biochar.
Yeah.
Where do those fit into the equation?
The only thing I really do consistently is twice a year I top dress with 1 to 2 inches of compost. I make a lot of my own compost, but I like to have it in other parts of my yard as well. So a lot of it goes into my raised beds as a top dressing. We have a source for bulk compost that we can buy and have delivered here. It's soil cubed in the Southeast, Alabama, Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, and Tennessee. It's really good stuff. So I'm able to get the quantity I need to top dress. Once a year, I'll use my broad fork and I'll go into the beds and I'll just rock the handle back and forth enough to have the tines open up access into the soil about 8 inches deep. And then I come in and do the top dressing so it goes down into those holes as well as across the top.
Yeah.
So it opens up airspace, root opportunity, infiltration, and just gets that compost a little deeper and faster. But that's all I really do, and that's all I've really done. I've had minimal applications of biochar. I just haven't had a chance to experiment enough with it yet. Mycorrhiza inoculant, somewhat, but not proactively yet. I love vermicompost. I add that. A little bit goes a long way, thankfully. It's not cheap, but it's good. And that's really it. One other thing I've done a few times through the years is mineralize my soil. So in addition to the compost, I'll buy locally sourced mineralized soil, which is basically some granite dust and maybe some other regionally sourced minerals that top dress to the soil. That's a great example of using your broad fork to get it down in, because you need that to get into that soil, because you're going to need those microbes to mineralize that to the point that it can become soluble enough to be taken up as a nutrient. That's going to take time for the rock-based minerals. I've noticed a big difference when it starts manifesting itself as a nutrient and getting into the plants. You don't have to do that often, but it's nice to do every so often.
Well, that's a really exciting answer for me. As somebody who seems like they've had a lot of exposure to different products, I imagine people are trying to send you samples of all kinds of things and see what you think of it as such an authority on gardening. The fact that you're really a compost-based gardener, that seems to be the heart of your fertility program.
Yes.
That's exciting, because good compost is something that we should all aim to have available locally, and instead of bagged amendments that get shipped around. So I think that's an exciting answer. Calling all Foodscapers, the 2025 Foodscaper Conference is your chance to get practical, actionable solutions to the business challenges you're facing every day. Join us virtually on February 12th and 13th. We got 2 days of workshops, networking, and sessions designed to close your knowledge gap and help you thrive. Whether you're looking to expand your services or just refine your design skills, this conference has got something for everyone. Podcast listeners can get a special 10% off discount when they use the code PODCAST. You can use that code at thefoodscaper.com. Let's get growing. So many Foodscapers have this experience. We're at a client's house and they come out asking for advice, where to order plants or where to get tools. Our clients trust our recommendations because we work with materials from companies we really trust. One of our most recommended places to get seeds is Botanical Interest by Epic Gardening. I've been ordering from Botanical Interest for years, and I love their selections of annual veggies, not to mention the beautiful artwork on their packaging. So Foodscapers, check out Botanical Interest for seeds. Tell your clients, shop at Botanical Interest.
You just made me think of something too. We started this conversation with our clients' need for instant gratification. So we want those beds to be filled quickly with a lot of soil and hit the ground running with that. I think one of the biggest problems with that is when we have to resort to soil amendments that aren't ready to be added into the garden. In other words, a lot of that is wood-based product. Box stores buy bagged soil products. It is mostly wood filler because the companies that are bagging this product, making and bagging this product to meet the demand of their contractual obligations with Home Depot and Lowe's, the volume of material that they need to deliver is, and so they've got a lot of pressure to make enough of this stuff fast enough so that it's actually soil-like by the time it goes into those bags so the customer gets it and puts it in their garden. But the fact of the matter is, and I know this from owners of companies that sell soil products to Lowe's and Home Depot, they're so challenged that oftentimes they recognize the fact that they can't fulfill that ethical obligation to, if it's still breaking down when we buy it in the bag and we're putting it into our gardens, and nitrogen depletion is happening because the wood is wanting to degrade more before the nitrogen is available to the plants, and it can't happen because the wood's breaking down and taking it. And then people wonder why their plants look crappy in that first year. They're stunted and they're not taking off. Well, it's because of what I just said. So that's another aspect that adds challenges to us as professionals working with our clients. We need to provide satisfactory, productive products right from the start, but we're challenged as providers of that too. And so our work is cut out for us, and educating ourselves and finding those sources who find those sources that have the good product. It's incumbent upon us to do the work to make that happen.
That is a really disappointing thing for me too. When I see so many clients getting these bags, it's pure organic matter and they call it soil. There's no soil components at all. I learned soil to be sand, silt, and clay, and organic matter to be an additive that gets incorporated into soil to give it more fertility and microbial life. But the fact that it's just pure junk mulch and so, but on the other hand, it's kind of funny because it does lead to people calling the professionals like us foodscapers and being like, my garden that I DIY'd was terrible. I need some professional help. And so in a funny way, they're really disappointing the gardeners of this country. And in another way, they're driving business towards foodscapers. I think you could make that argument. I wonder if other foodscapers had that experience.
You know what, Matt? What you just said made me think back to part of our conversation earlier when foodscapers are thinking about leaving another job to do this full time and how they grow their business. I think being truthful and honest and educating your prospects or your clients with information like that to set the expectations accurately so that they understand you have their best interest at heart. And although this may not be your best garden ever in the first year, here's why that may be, but here's how we're going to keep an eye on that and work on improving that over time. But setting those expectations up front differentiates yourself from the guy who's trying to get that job and tell people what they want to hear, and then they're out of there once the job is done and they have their check and they're on to the next person. You're, as the person that educated them properly, you're going to stand out and they're going to brag about you to their friends and colleagues who see the success that garden ultimately has. And that's how you build your business. I'm a firm believer, whatever success I have has a lot to do with the fact that I adhere to a saying I learned from one of my mentors in life, and that is people buy differences, not similarities. So, I mean, if you're just doing what everybody else is doing, how do you stand out from that? You have to show your unique qualities. And I think what I just mentioned is one example of where you can do that in this industry.
Giving good soil to people who want a garden is probably the single most beautiful gift you can give them. It's the foundation for everything. Joe, thank you for going down that rabbit hole of your home garden with me. I loved hearing about that design and your soil and some of the things that make it special for you. I'd love to take us into the next chapter of our conversation and hear more about the greater world of gardens that you have experienced, because that is such a gift to have been in so many different garden spaces. I want to take us outside of your Atlanta homestead. I'm curious about other places you've visited that really stand out to you as unique designs, or they live on in your memory as like, wow, if I could do a different garden, I'd do one like that, or just other pieces of inspiration for us foodscapers that we can either stalk online, hear your report about here, or maybe even go visit in person.
You're right. I've been to thousands of gardens over the careers, 3 television series that I've had over 20 something years. visiting gardens for every episode. There's one that comes to mind that happened during COVID. And this, keep in mind, by then I'd been 20 years on TV doing shows all over the country and outside of it. I was driving down the road to run an errand from my house one day, 2 miles at the most from my house, going down the street I always go down. There was a sign on the hill strip between the sidewalk and the road. It said plant sale, pointing into the subdivision. I'm a sucker for plants. I'm a plantaholic. And it's like, I can't even believe I didn't turn in because I had a lunch meeting. I came back home the same way, and there was that sign. By then, I was anxious to get home because I needed to catch up on some business, so I couldn't turn in then. I thought, oh, well, I missed that one. Not knowing that the next day, which was a Saturday, I'd be running another errand, which took me right down past that sign. And this time, I turned in. And I went down the road, and as I was getting to the home, there were just cars all up and down the road. I'm like, what is going on? And I looked towards the yard of the home, and it had a beautiful vegetable garden in the front yard. And that alone was gorgeous. But they were on 2 acres and had a woodland area set aside that had, a lot of native plants in it, many native plants, tall native hardwoods, limbed up beautifully. I mean, it was gorgeous. And then water features. I walked up, introduced myself, and overheard that I could walk around the yard and take a look. And I did. I was so overwhelmed with joy. I eventually shared with them, who I was and what I did. And we ended up filming an episode there. It's a standout garden. I'll never forget the couple. That might've been the greatest part of the whole show, was their love story as soulmates and passionate gardeners who, for their entire married life, which was most of their life, gardened together always. And they built this beautiful place from scratch, one day at a time. I think it's episode 1111. You can watch it on YouTube, GGW TV's channel. And then I'm sure you know Bree Arthur, who lives in Fuquay, Varina, North Carolina, which is really a suburb of Raleigh. And she wrote this Foodscape Revolution book, I think. She's a friend, a good friend, and a correspondent in my show, but she's all about educating people, not only professionals in the industry, but home gardeners. And she does a great job of incorporating it stealthily into landscapes because she designs well too. It's all blended in. She's a great inspiration and just a very unique, very talented person. That's a great attribute to this industry, both professionally and for home gardeners. So that's Bree. And then Susan Mulvihill in the Pacific Northwest. She's in Washington State and has a beautiful garden and grows a lot of food. She's a great educator and master gardener and has a beautiful garden. She and her husband, Bill, do amazing things in their garden. I think those are the 3 that come to mind.
One of the things that you said a few times there is this blended garden. Tease that out a little bit for us. What do you mean by blended, and why do you see that as a desirable trait in a garden?
Blended probably is synonymous with Foodscape. When I said that with these contexts, I'm thinking that these are people that have a truly dedicated vegetable garden, a landscape garden, usually of native plants, but then they see the value of the edibles blended with the non-edibles because of the aesthetics of the edibles. For example, in my case, I have 5 acres, but half of it's pasture. The other 2.5 are my vegetable garden in native landscape beds. In those beds, one edible I put in all over the place are blueberries, just because of their beauty all season. So when I talk about blended, that's what I mean.
Yeah, I think that's a really nice way of speaking about it. One of the things that we're always struggling with is Foodscapers is talking about edible landscaping. I personally differentiate edible landscaping from raised bed vegetable gardening, and generally Foodscapers do both. We plant the native landscapes with blueberries and fruit trees. We will build your vegetable garden and advise you on that.
Perfect.
But what you're talking about is we create blended landscapes of native and edible plants. Something to that nature feels like a really nice way of describing this to clients that feels very palatable. This blending idea feels alluring and very approachable in terms of creating something that's not going to scare people away.
And you know what else, Matt, I like about the blended is that, especially when I'm using native edibles and fruit trees in with the perennials and other native plants that aren't edible. As someone passionate about coevolution of our wildlife with our plant culture, I love to see
Yeah,
the food sources provided by what I've planted, along with the nectar and the pollen that is inherent in the native plants, the berries and the
totally.
fruit mixed in from the local indigenous natives as well.
We have so much to learn from the indigenous plant keepers of this land that we are on. And that is one of my greatest hopes for the foodscaping movement, that we can tap more into indigenous wisdom and get rooted in place with the plants that have sustained people for millennia here,
Yeah.
and think about how we can thoughtfully reestablish those relationships. I'm curious about what other trends that you might have to offer our foodscaping industry folks that you see. Of course, we're plant geeks and all that, but we're also need to be smart business people and be thinking about, where is this movement going? You've seen a lot over your career, and I would imagine you've got some good insight as to what's coming down the pike.
I think educating ourselves so that we can serve our clients to the best of our ability is key. And for me, I think that's been kind of a hallmark of just who I am. I'm a reader. I love consuming accurate information from reliable sources. I'm proud to feel like I am in the know. But that just doesn't come to me in my sleep. I mean, I have to get up, and I get up early and I read and I study and I sharpen my saw every day. And I think we should, if we
Mm.
really want to make our mark and stand out, we need to do that. But as far as trends and trying to be aware and on top of what's happening and keeping my finger on the pulse, I am encouraged by what I see when I am out there with people. For example, I'm a member of the Georgia Native Plant Society because I definitely want more people to be aware of plant choices we have when we're deciding what to put into our gardens and landscapes. And I'm encouraged when we go on native plant rescues or when we go to native plant meetings and things, the number of younger people today versus 10, 15 years ago for sure. But even in the last few years, the momentum happening now with the excitement and enthusiasm towards the plant choices that we're making and the fact that we're pushing back on nursery plants that are juiced with neonicotinoids and why that's not a good thing, and speaking with our wallets and deciding where those dollars are going, that there's a lot of power there. And I feel like we're gaining momentum. And having been in this industry for 30 years or more, it was not that way back then. It's like back then, people were saying, what can I spray on this plant to kill it? As Doug Tallamy said, there was a time when all we asked of our gardens was that they be pretty and nothing more.
Right.
Now we need them to not only satisfy our aesthetic needs, but we need it to do all these other things and support wildlife and slow runoff and sequester carbon and all of these other things. Things have changed. But because of the Doug Tallamys of the world and people like you and me and others, many others, word's getting out and it's catching on. And dare I say, it's kind of cool. And I don't know if people are consciously doing it because it's the thing, but I think they're doing it because they understand why they need to do it. It's the why that's driving the action. And that conversation is relatively new to what used to be. And I'm so thankful of that. But we're also in a major race against a monumental force. And we don't have that much time. I don't want to be gloom and doom here, but I think part of the trends and the encouragement comes from the fact that as gardeners, and there are millions of us, we are a mighty force collectively. And the more we take action in those ways, the more hopeful I become. Hopefully I hit something.
Definitely. I think that definitely resonates with people and answers the question. And yeah, you alluded to this idea of kind of being an educator and that learning new things and then sharing those things with your community, whether that be friends and family, or in your case, with an actual TV audience. I think that's a really important part of the Foodscaper story, because so many of us who are foodscape entrepreneurs, we have to be educators. There's no such thing as just being a good designer and to learn about soil blends and then go do that. Like, we've got to get out there in the community and share this knowledge, at least if we want our companies to take off, because we've got to do the education to establish ourselves as reliable sources. I'm curious about what I'm going to call the hook, or any stories you might have for when somebody approaches you about like getting started with gardening, or have you had any experiences where you're like, that hooked them? This is like, this is what I use for bait. I encourage them to do X, Y, and Z on their patio, or try this experiment. How do we get more gardeners who might be like, I'm garden curious? How do we get them like in on this?
Good question. You're never going to be a better gardener until you at least get started. And you will make mistakes and be glad when you do, because the only way you become better is by making mistakes and learning from those mistakes, and then trying to put your detective hat on and figuring out why those mistakes happened. And then you get better. And I say, ultimately, you transition from what I would compare as a cook to a chef, where as a new gardener, you could be the cook and you could follow a recipe and you're going to make a great meal or a great container. But are you going to know why that all worked? No, you just followed the steps. Nothing wrong with that. But if you want to grow and feel more, as I say, better, smarter, more confident gardener, you need to understand the why do behind the how to. The recipe card is the how to. The why do is what the chef does when he is tasked with making a great meal, but he doesn't have a recipe card, but he has a pantry. He or she goes into the pantry, they look at the ingredients, and they can put together that amazing meal because they know what works together and why it works and what not to use.
Yeah.
And so I try to paint that picture with people who are on the fence. And a lot of times they don't start because they don't feel like they know enough. And I said, you're never going to know enough until you start trying. Then you start knowing, and then you can start getting better. But you can't get better until you start screwing up.
Yeah. The mistakes, they are just the only proven teacher, right?
Yeah, they're the best teacher.
Yep, that's for sure. I think one of the things that's coming up for me as you share that is encouraging people to get started and letting them know ahead of time that like things are going to die, mistakes are going to be made, and that bugs are going to eat things, and that
Yes.
disease will ruin things, and that that expectation setting from the beginning is maybe the most valuable piece of advice
Yeah.
that will allow them to endure and not give up hope that first season.
That's the other part. I failed to say it, but when they do get started, sometimes they bite off more than they can chew, and their ambition outweighs their ability to keep up with it. And we know seeds and plants have the DNA in them to take off given the right conditions. And with even a little blind luck, you can give them the right conditions and it could become overwhelming. And I find that happens often. The exuberance takes over, and then it's like overwhelm and it's burnout all in one season.
Yep.
So Matt, your advice is really, really sound in setting those expectations before it happens.
Hearing you talk about just these plants, they've got the genetics already pre-programmed to do these miracles. I'm curious, are there any plants or varieties that you're experimenting with right now that you feel really jazzed about?
So keep in mind, I've been gardening since I was 8, and I've been growing a lot of stuff. Edibles, flowers, you name it. But in the last few years, what I'm most jazzed about is combining my edibles with my native perennials, mostly flowers, so that I increase the biodiversity in my garden, which then helps with natural pest control and disease resistance. And it's phenomenal how alive the garden becomes. What I've seen in the past few years when we have intentionally created spaces around and within the raised vegetable beds for those pollen and nectar sources to bring in the predatory and beneficial insects and the pollinators and just the birds. And suddenly it's like, oh my gosh, I feel like I've been reborn, and it's more exciting than ever. And that's saying a lot, because for me, as much as I love gardening and as long as I've been gardening, and I say this a lot, I love gardening more today than yesterday, and tomorrow I'm going to love it more than today. Part of that is always being open to change and not being stuck in your ways and getting in ruts. And for me, with the recognition of the need for increased healthy biodiverse environments, why in our own little corner of the world, whatever land is under our watch, we need to do our part to make that happen. And I'm just proud to say that I'm doing everything that I can. And it's self-gratifying and fulfilling, very pleasing too.
It sounds like you're getting that nourishment from the garden, as well as obviously the food and the flowers.
Right.
It brings me to one of the questions that we're always talking about as foodscapers, which is like work-life balance and maintaining our own sanity. And you have obviously worked really hard over your career to get all of the opportunities that have come your way. I'm curious what wisdom, or do you have any practices that really help you maintain that work-life balance? Because the garden is always calling. There's always more content you can put out these days. One more video, one more podcast, whatever, one more person to talk to. And what comes up for you there?
That's a really great question. So off the top, there's a lot of pressure to feed the social media algorithm every day. And as someone who has an established brand, it's still important, just as important for me to keep showing up in people's feeds every day as it is for the person trying to get to that point. But I've reconciled within myself, and maybe a lot of that has to do with the fact that I'm of a certain age and experience that I don't feel like I've got to play the algorithm game every day. So I don't. And has that cost me? I'm sure it has, but has it freed up a lot of me time and mental health? Yes, absolutely. And so that trade-off for me has been very healing, to let go of the pressure that I've felt for a long time. If you are feeling the need to post, when you do, I feel like it's important that you're not posting to be like somebody else's post. You're posting to be who you are and what you know, as a real, candid, front-facing person that lets us know who you are. I don't want to see you doing the same thing as the 50 things that just scroll through my feed, which I see a lot. I don't like that. It's a turnoff to me. But the other thing I do for self-preservation, 5 years ago, I started taking August off for sabbatical. And that is because the demands of my schedule and the constant pressure and the incessant, never-ending stream of need to get back to people and communicate and reply to emails and comments and, all that comes your way over the years of being out there in a public life is intense. And eventually it takes its toll to the point that you just need to rest and recharge and refresh and regenerate and renew and all those things, recover, all those words that start with RE. It may not be a month, it may be a week. I've learned that is transformational in my well-being, in my outlook on life, and my mental health. But once I did it, I knew I would never not do it. And I did very little business-related things in August, and most of it's just reading and projects that I need to get to that fall into my to-do basket throughout the year that land into the August bucket. So those are two things. I would say one last thing, Matt, and that is, as this profession started taking off, because gardening has always been my passion and love of my life. Sometimes when your business becomes your passion, you got to be careful that it doesn't become your prison too. And so I always have been mindful of the fact that I never wanted my passion to become my prison. And when I felt like it was getting in that direction, you needed to make a change. Whatever that was, you need to disconnect and get back to it.
Yeah, I love that sabbatical idea. And I feel like, for me personally, very hard boundaries like that are really the only thing that works. Because if I exist in this in-between space where I'm going to cut back a little bit, or I'm going to just leave early, those don't work. There's always just another thing that comes in. If I draw a hard line, it's like I'm totally off grid, offline, not doing my work, and I tell everybody and I change my email response, then that's enough to push me over the edge.
Yep. I think you need an accountability person, and you need those guardrails. And I don't know about you, but I'm pretty disciplined. But here's the thing that we all need to be careful about. If we're planning ahead like this and we think we want to do this and we say we're going to do it, so we block it off on our calendar, let's just say, because like my next August for 2025 is already blocked off. But, next month, somebody's going to ask me to speak somewhere. And I'm going to say, oh, that's just a day, two, maybe getting there and back. I can do that. And then there's another thing that shows up and you say yes to that. And before you know it, your whole month that you had to yourself is no longer a month to yourself. It's a couple of days, and you're going to resent it. So let me just offer that to anybody that's thinking that someday they would like to do this. This is my advice. Be true to that time and don't sacrifice anything.
Yeah. Say no to everything. I love it. We are a culture desperately in need of getting better at saying no right now.
Yeah.
Well, Joe, we're winding down to the end of our time, and I want to make sure that we take some time to hear a little bit about all of the educational offerings that you have put out. We've got all these foodscapers, they're gardeners, they're entrepreneurs, they're designers. Give us some direction as to some places to plug in to your work.
I would say the first place is my podcast, The Joe Gardner Show. As of today, we had our 377th consecutive weekly episode.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah.
That's amazing.
So what is that? 8 years almost, maybe more.
That's
Something
a lot of
math. Yeah. And with the podcast, because we are doing it weekly, talking about being on the cutting edge and staying on top of relevant topics, we're able to do that. So that's the one thing. And then the other thing I would say, other than the YouTube channels, the Online Gardening Academy I created in 2019 because we had a lot of people wanting to go deeper on specific topics related to gardening. And that stuff really wasn't out there yet. Online courses were just getting started. And now I think we have about 7 or 8 courses. Some are very comprehensive. Others are not as deep. But we hear good things about all of them. And so that's another place where I would direct people because interestingly enough, master gardeners who put on educational programs oftentimes provide their master gardener students credit hours for attending our Online Gardening Academy courses. I take that as a good sign. So those are two options.
Those are fantastic options. And I personally have been inspired by so many of your podcasts. I know specifically you mentioned Doug Tallamy and he's really just part of that whole blend and the trend and where we need to take landscaping and thinking about the ecological benefit. That's maybe an episode. I think you've talked to him more than once, actually.
Yeah.
And those are a great place to start if people are looking to dive in there. Joe, thank you so much for sharing so much of your wisdom. You're clearly a born educator and a great speaker. I'm very grateful to have spent this time with you here.
It's been a pleasure to spend time with you, and thank you for your great questions. It doesn't have to end with this podcast or video. They can reach out to me at heyjoe@joegardner.com, and I'll actually answer you back. We can keep the conversation going.
You can't beat that offer. You are certainly a trusted guide for those of us in North America. So thank you, Joe.
Thank you, Matt. Likewise.
If this podcast inspired you or taught you something new, it would mean so much if you could give us 30 seconds of your time, follow or subscribe to the Foodscaper Podcast. And while you're there, if you could give us a 5-star review or rating, that would be so greatly appreciated. These small acts help us grow the foodscaping movement. Thank you for listening to the Foodscaper Podcast. Keep growing. Big thanks to our official fruit tree nursery sponsor, Stark Brothers, for supporting today's episode. Stark Brothers offers a survival guarantee on their plants for the first year. Shop at starkbros.com. Big thanks to our official garden supply sponsor, Epic Gardening, for supporting today's episode. Check out Epic Gardening at shop.epicgardening.com.